So Lisa asked me to talk about the ABCs, I think, of pesticides in the environment. I think that's the title she put down there. Well, first of all, I'm in the Department of Environmental and Molecular Toxicology at Oregon State. That sounds like a mouthful, doesn't it? When I came to OSU almost 25 years ago, it was the Department of Agricultural Chemistry. I'm trained as a chemist, as a toxicologist. I understand how chemicals move around in the environment. I understand how they affect humans and wildlife. Recently, I've done a fair amount of research on the effect of pesticides on salmon, salmonids, and you may have heard about low levels of pesticides affecting how salmon smell, their ability to smell, and how that affects their behavior in the environment. Well, one of my graduate students worked on some of the original research with NOAA Fisheries to better understand how pesticides affect salmon. So I'm going to talk to you tonight about how EPA, our federal environmental protection agency, how they evaluate pesticides. And I'm going to focus primarily on pesticides in the environment rather than the health effects side. But I will touch on it a little bit. So I'm also part of Cooperative Extension, and I'm also part of something called the National Pesticide Information Center, which is a service provided by Oregon State University nationally. It's a cooperative agreement with EPA. We use EPA resources to answer folks' calls, or we have a website that provides a lot of information about pesticides. So EPA does risk assessment and management under something called FIFRA, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. It was amended in 1996 by something called the Food Quality Protection Act, and it's a quasi-risk-benefit statute. And it's kind of unique in that regard to other statutes, like the Clean Water Act or the Clean Air Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act. This act does balance benefits and risks. Pesticides have to have a benefit, or they shouldn't be put into the environment. And then you balance that benefit with the risks. And so EPA looks at risk to human health and the environment. They look at toxicity to humans and wildlife, and then they look for opportunities for exposure. And I know one of the reasons that you're all here is because of that concern about exposure. And before a product is registered, it goes through an awful lot of testing. It costs millions of dollars. And then EPA makes a decision. Are we going to register this product or not? Can it be used safely? And can some benefit be obtained from this product in some safe way? And then periodically, when there's new data and new science, they go back and re-look at all of the data and all the new data, and they decide, are we going to re-register this product? And right now, the law says they have to do that every 15 years. Seems like a long time, but there's a lot of pesticides that they have to evaluate. So when they decide to re-register a product, usually they make changes. And those are called mitigation measures. And so the label changes. And we've talked tonight about Washington's Forest Practices Act being different than Oregon's, and different buffers possibly required in Washington. That's at the state level, but that's the kind of change that EPA could make right on the label. And a pesticide label, that's a little different than the label that's on the drugs you take. The pesticide label is a legal document. If you don't follow the directions on the drugs you take, you're not breaking the law. If a pesticide user doesn't follow the directions on the label, it's a legal document. They're breaking the law. So, and the other thing that's very important about pesticide labels is that they're not site-specific. So if a product is registered in Oregon for use on forestry, then it can be used anywhere in Oregon on forestry. And then it's then it's up to the applicator to make site-specific decisions about how they use that product. So in this process of evaluating pesticides for risk, you look at two things. You look at what are the effects, how it might affect me, and how will I be exposed. And really risk is what EPA focuses in on. It's a risk assessment. And in the big picture, they're saying, how are these pesticides used? What's the human or wildlife susceptibility and behavior? And they're looking at those two things together to try to evaluate risk. And so pesticide use practices are really a way of saying, what are the opportunities to be exposed to those pesticides, either humans or wildlife? And there's kind of a target that's used in a lot of risk assessments that says, if I decide on a level that causes an adverse effect, either to humans and wildlife, what sort of margin of exposure would make me feel comfortable about putting that chemical into the environment? And it's generally around 100. You want the opportunity for exposure to a chemical to be at a concentration that's 100 times lower than what might cause an adverse effect. And that's just kind of a general rule of thumb. And again, I'm talking about how our federal government evaluates putting chemicals out into the environment and evaluating what's acceptable. And sometimes they call that the level of concern. So the level of concern is, in most cases, am I going to be exposed to that chemical at a level that exceeds 100 times lower than the level that causes a toxic effect? And so they use this in a process of risk assessment and management. First, you look at the hazard. How is it toxic, either to humans and wildlife? Then you look at what's called a dose response, and that's how toxic is it. If it only takes a little bit to cause a toxic effect, it has a higher toxicity than if it takes a lot. So you've got, how is it hazardous? What's the potency? How potent is it? That's the dose response part. And then you combine that with, am I going to be exposed to it at all, or at what level? And that all gets put together in something called risk characterization. And then that's kind of the science side. And then it goes over to the policy side. And EPA makes decisions about whether a pesticide is going to be registered and what are the conditions by which it's registered. And those conditions are put on the label, that legal document. And so it starts with, and I think there's a pointer here someplace. Oh, here it is. So it starts over here with the potential risks. And EPA does a risk assessment, and that helps them decide what the label is going to do in the risk management phase, cost-effective requirements to ensure safe use. And then there needs to be a clear understanding of label restrictions and mandates, so whoever's using this product must have a clear understanding of how it can be used properly. And then finally, the idea is that informed decision-making at the front line of pesticide use, you get safe and beneficial use. So it's really up to the applicator in the end to do the right thing. And our federal government and state government, Department of Ag and Forestry, who also are involved in these laws, there's a process set up so that if the applicator does his or her job, that product can be used safely. And so one of my roles in this process is in this clear understanding and in this informed decision making. So almost all applicators in Oregon have to be licensed, and in order to get a license, they have to take continuing education, and I'm one of the guys that does the continuing education. And so they have to go to these classes to get credits because they need to get so many credits, or they have to take the test over again. So it's an educational opportunity for me. I get to do my job outside of the university, but with the applicator audience. So the environmental fate part, that part of when they put the chemical into the environment, what's the objective? And so what I look at is, once that chemical goes into the environment, I'm looking at how long does it last and where's it going to go? And what you're trying to do is get the maximum benefit out of the product, that's this term efficacy, with the minimal environmental impact. So you want to make sure you apply it to where it needs to go, you get pest control, you have minimal impact on beneficials and non-target species, it doesn't move anywhere, and then it goes away. And I know most of you here don't think that this is how most pesticides work. This is the overall objective. And depending on who you talk to, whether it's the forest industry or the ag industry or whoever the user community is, they probably think they're doing a better job of this than you guys do. And that's where the debate comes in. So the first thing that happens is that you put the chemical in the environment some way. And that really starts the process of environmental fate. And when we're talking about forestry or any application, we're talking about drift. That's that putting it where it needs to be and that it doesn't leave the site where it's supposed to be. And EPA and state agencies, drift is a very, very hot topic and a high topic on everybody's radar screen. How do we keep that product where it's supposed to be? This is a recent definition of drift. Drift is the physical movement of pesticide droplets or particles through the air at the time of pesticide application or soon after from the target site or any non or off-target site. And so this is a general working definition. This is not what some call post-application volatile loss. After it's been applied, it's been there for a while, and then there can be some volatilization back up into the atmosphere. This is what happens at the time or soon after application. And so here's a helicopter operation to a clear cut a long ways away from, at least in this picture, we don't see any water, we don't see any houses. This is kind of isolated, and we'll get to this in a minute. This kind of an application doesn't drift very much, and we'll get to this. Under many circumstances, you can keep this contained on the site, and we'll get to some of the reasons why in a minute. And so, how can spray drift be controlled? And there are best management practices for drift. Monitor the weather, you understand your application practices, use something called drift reduction technologies. So there's a constantly evolving effort going into finding better ways to apply chemicals and really thinking about reducing drift. Buffers and vegetative barriers, and we talked a little bit about buffers earlier, the buffers around streams, and then identifying sensitive areas. And so the factors that affect drift are the chemical, the formulation, the additives, the droplet size, evaporation, but most importantly, and I don't think I have it up here, it's something called the release height. So the higher you release it, you can just think of a droplet being anything that has mass. The higher you release it, and let's say the wind's blowing this way, the higher you release it, the farther it's going to drift. And so all of that is taken into account by the applicator. They know the wind speed, they know how much mass their droplets have. They actually fly and apply it in a way knowing that some of it's going to move sideways. And it's done in a way to meet the label requirements, supposedly. Weather conditions are very important, and those are talked about earlier, but they're all factored into how the application's done. You can imagine that some weather conditions it's probably easier to keep the chemical on the site, and other weather conditions it's hard. This is up to the applicator, it's their decision. They understand all of the factors that control when they release those droplets, where they're going to go, and based on their experience on the site, their objective is to put the chemical on the site and nowhere else. So this is kind of a busy slide, and I'm not going to go through all of these, but the idea is that this is a recent slide put out by EPA, and I guess the point is that there's a lot of boxes on here and a lot of categories, and there's a lot of thought constant thought going on within EPA about drift. And so forestry applications use very large droplets. EPA is concerned about droplets that are less than about 150 microns. They call those the driftable ones. Forestry applications are usually in the 1,000 micron range. They have the luxury of using large droplets and still getting control. In other situations, you have to use small droplets or you don't get control. So one of the things that I follow is once that chemical's put out onto that forestry site, where does it go? And these are all the kind of pathways where it can go. It can volatilize back up into the atmosphere, run off, leach to groundwater, and it also is degrading as soon as it's applied. And so what you really want to know is, from chemical fate, you want to know what's the fate of the chemical. That determines bioavailability to either humans or wildlife, and then exposure. And one of the ways that we look at a chemical is how quickly does it go away after it's been put out into the environment. And these are all the processes that are going on simultaneously. Some of it's volatilizing, some of it's breaking down by sunlight, some of it's been being taken up by the plant, some of it's degrading chemically, microbially, and in some situations it's running off. And all these things are happening simultaneously, and this is called dissipation. And so and one of the ways that we look at dissipation is through something called half-life. And that's the time it takes for, when the chemical's applied, for half of it to go away. And so here's a list of the chemicals that were in question in Cedar Valley. I've also included atrazine as kind of a reference. And here's their half-lives in days. So 2,4-D has the shortest half-life, imazapyr has the longest half-life. And you can see they vary between 10 days and 90 days. So the imazapyr is the most persistent one. It takes 90 days for half of the imazapyr to go away. It only takes 10 days for half of the 2,4-D to go away. Now this is in soil. And we have a lot of data on how pesticides degrade in soil. We have less data on how pesticides degrade on surfaces, foliar surfaces. But they generally degrade quicker on foliar surfaces, or dissipate, excuse me. They dissipate faster on foliar surfaces than they do in soil. So this half-life thing, what is that? Well, here's an amount applied, it's 1 kilogram. 14 days later, half of it's gone. If the half-life is 20 days, it takes 20 days for half of it to go away. If it's 90 days, it takes 90 days for half of it to go away. But then what happens? What happens in the next 90 days? Another half goes away. And then what happens the next 90 days? Another half goes away. And then another. So here's a little table over here. It takes 3.3 half-lives for there to only be 10% remaining, 6.6 or 1% remaining, 10 half-lives to get down to 0.1%. So half-life doesn't end after the first one. It just keeps going. What? Infinitely, yes. Right. And so the point is, right, until it all goes away. Okay, so, and I'm not going to, I don't have any time left. Or we talk about that in some detail. But, right. Yeah, that one says that. So one of the ways that chemicals go away is that they're mineralized. They're converted to CO2, hydrogen, oxygen, and carbon, and minerals. That's gone away. But chemicals also go away in other ways where they degrade into other compounds. And then we've got to know, well, what are those other compounds, and are they toxic in their own right? And that's what makes what I do interesting, complicated. So here's some data, and I just wanted to show you that this is some data that comes out of a database that I put together a few years ago. Here's some of the trade names of the products that were applied out there. Here's their common name. Here's those half-life values. Something called a KOC. that tells you how tightly the chemical binds to soil. So if you've got primarily solution runoff and the chemical's bound to soil, then it's probably going to stay put. If it's bound to soil and you've got sediment runoff, then maybe some of the chemical's going to be moving on the sediment. Water solubility, and then something called vapor pressure, and that tells you how volatile it is. So up here, the smaller this number is, the more volatile it is. So 2,4-diester and triclopyr are the most volatile. Oust, the sulfmethuron methyl, the glyphosate, and the imazapyr, they're pretty non-volatile compounds. And particularly the sulfmethuron methyl and the glyphosate really don't have any vapor pressure. So with that, I'll again tell you about the National Pesticide Information Center at Oregon State University, and I think my time is up.
Well, thank you, Dr. Jenkins. Can you talk about volatilization and revolatilization, especially in coastal foggy forests?
Okay, so as far as pesticides volatilizing, does fog matter? Closer? You know, this topic came up, I think, in the Highway 36 investigation too, and there's actually been some research done in California. You know that valley fog they have down there in the wintertime? There was research done back in the 80s on pesticides moving into fog as a vehicle for pesticides to move around. And you know that table I had up there with that water solubility data on it? The more water soluble it is, the more likely it might be in fog. Except for fog forms based on particulates, water condensing around particulates, the chemical could be on the particulate in the fog particle. So yes, it's there, and yes, fog can have pesticide residues in it. And then the question is, what does that mean? Is that a different exposure pathway than if it's in the air? And should we be more concerned about pesticides in fog than we are breathing pesticides in air? And that I can't say, whether it's more risky if it's in the fog or if it's in the air.
Thank you. Next question. What benefit does the EPA Environmental Protection Agency see to the environment from pesticide use?
You know, these days, EPA leaves the benefit part of it up to the marketplace. So EPA does not decide whether a chemical is beneficial or not. It leaves that up to the chemical company. So let's say that there's four herbicides out there that are being used in forestry, and they have different kind of niches in weed control, and a chemical company wants to bring a new product onto the market. They're going to do field trials comparing their new product to the existing products. And they're going to decide, will my product compete in the marketplace with the existing products? And so EPA doesn't really decide the benefit. It needs to have a benefit, but they don't decide how it's done.
Okay. Final question. Who monitors and tests the toxicity of multiple chemicals mixed together, and does anyone know what their effects are?
Mixtures is kind of one of the concerns du jour across the board, not only for humans, but for wildlife. EPA does not test all mixtures. That's a given. But when EPA determines the hazard of a chemical, they need to know how it's toxic. And how much information do you think they need to know on how it's toxic? A lot, right? And let's just take humans, one species. We won't talk about the environment or wildlife, which is a whole bunch of species. We'll just talk about one species, humans. So how many tests do you think they have to do to know all the, I'm going to use the word plausible, all the plausible ways that chemical could be toxic? Probably not enough to satisfy this room, I guarantee you, that they haven't done enough testing. But toxicologists inside of the federal government that make this decision, how much testing is enough, there is a limit to how much testing that is required. And it costs millions of dollars. Let's say just for the toxicity testing for a new chemical, somewhere around 80 million, 100 million, something like that. They do. They do pay for it. Then you ask the question, who? Pardon? So one approach to ensuring that however it's done is impartial would be for an independent lab to do all the testing. That's one approach, which would probably, I think, if we lined up all the approaches in this audience, that would be the one that would be chosen. We choose that one. The way they actually do it is that they have oversight of all the testing. And so EPA comes up with all the protocols for testing that the companies must follow. Then when all the data comes in, EPA does an audit. And these audits, the number one, when EPA audits the chemical data from the chemical companies, at the top of their list is this data fraudulent? That's at the top of their list. Fraud deterrence. Then you get down to evaluating the science. And it costs a lot of money for the chemical companies to do tests where they can demonstrate that it's not fraudulent. That's not even talking about the science. That's just that they're not trying to fool the agency. So when you look at all plausible ways that a chemical could harm you, then you know something about the mechanism by which it affects you. Some chemicals affect you differently. Some chemicals are organ-specific, some cause cancer, some don't. And so they use that data, all that testing data on humans, to understand whether, from what we call a mechanistic standpoint, is synergism plausible? They don't test all the chemicals. They don't do the n factorial experiment from a statistical standpoint. They use a mechanistic approach to assess, based on experience, to assess whether synergism is plausible or not.
Let's have a hand for Dr. Jenkins. Thank you very much. Okay. We now have our last and final speaker, Rosemarie Fiorello. And she's going to talk a case study of atrazine.
Again, a little bit of background. I'm an attorney. I also have an undergrad in environmental science and chemistry. And I have always been interested in herbicides and pesticides. I actually published a paper about atrazine, paraquat, and 2,4-D as an undergrad. So it's long been an interest of mine, and I actually practice. I'm originally from New Jersey, and I practice in the Midwest. But since my brother lives in Oregon, decided to move a bit closer to him, and so now I'm on the West Coast. So I was one of the primary attorneys in atrazine litigation, Greenville and Holiday Shores, and oops, hold on one second. Sorry, getting a little bit ahead of myself. Okay. No, it's all right. It is right. So atrazine, I'm sure you've all heard about it multiple times this evening, but it is a pre- and post-emergent herbicide used to control broadleaf and grassy weeds in a variety of crops, primarily to corn, sorghum, and sugarcane, and of course it's used in forestry. About 75 million pounds are applied yearly in the United States. And two of the key chemical characteristics are that it does not readily bind to soil, causing runoff, and it persists in the environment with a water half-life approaching 2 years. That's the data I have. I know there was 60 days earlier this evening, but it really does depend on the type of soil. But it certainly does not bind to soil. It is the #1 contaminant in U.S. drinking water, according to USGS. Atrazine has been banned in the EU since 2004, and in Italy and Germany since since 1991. What's interesting, at least to me, is the parent company of the primary registrant of atrazine is Swiss. So, and they don't use it in Switzerland. And one of the reasons that atrazine, at least they say, is still heavily used is because corn yields would go down if they didn't use atrazine. But actually, in Italy and Germany, their corn yields have stayed the same, if not gone up. So back to my case, the plaintiffs, it was a class action, were community water systems that had spent significant sums of money filtering atrazine from their raw water supplies before serving it to its customers to comply with an EPA standard of 3 parts per billion. So one of the claims in the case were that since atrazine is a highly regulated herbicide, nonetheless, when used as intended, it would run off farmers' fields and get into the water supply. It's actually made to run off in a sense because, especially in the Midwest, farmers who plant corn, typically after they plant corn, plant soybeans. Atrazine doesn't kill corn, but it does kill soybeans. So they can't have any carryover. So that's why atrazine has to run off the soil and not bind to the soil, because otherwise when the farmers plant soybeans, it would kill the soybeans. So the litigation went on for about 8 years, and when all was said and done, we were able to secure a $105 million settlement that was distributed to the community water systems. We actually got paid, and the community water systems got 100% of their damages back. So that is pretty rare, and certainly rare in a class action. And one of the city of Vail in Oregon actually made a claim and got about $6,000. So some birth defects associated with atrazine: hypospadias, gastroschisis, small for gestational age. So essentially, hypospadias affects boys. It's where the hole, instead of being at the end of the penis, is somewhere along the shaft. And it's typically noticed right at birth and subsequently repaired with surgery. So what causes hypospadias? It's essentially a lack of testosterone, or the larger class of hormones, and androgen. And androgen is a hormone that stimulates or controls the development and maintenance of male characteristics. It prevents androgens from expressing their biological effects on responsive tissues. You know what? This is not. Can I pause one moment? This actually is a different version of, I must have given you the prior version somehow. Okay, nonetheless, we'll go on. So essentially, it is a lack of androgens in a critical window of development that causes hypospadias. Oops, that's not. Oh, that's okay. So there are studies that from the CDC that show that severe hypospadias is increasing. And by severe, that's typically a 3rd degree. And the severity of hypospadias depends on how far down the hole is, or how far down it is from the shaft, or how far down the shaft it is, excuse me. No, that's okay. We can.
It's so easy, I think.
I thought there was a different version, but that's okay. I have it in my computer.
Sorry for this. Oops, there it was. So, come on.
Sure. It was for. No, it went towards filtration costs. So the community water systems got money for having to filter atrazine out of their raw water supplies, essentially. And in some places, some of the community water systems had such a severe problem with atrazine that they actually had to make capital improvements. So they really were. They had to filter out the atrazine because of the EPA's MCL. So they were specifically filtering for atrazine.
And how effectively does that filter out the atrazine?
Well, it depends on what type of system they have. They can have a granular activated carbon system, which essentially is like a giant Brita, if you will. Some systems use powder activated carbon, so they actually just put in bags of carbon. The problem is typically in the spring when obviously they're spraying a lot and there are really high peaks. So even though the EPA standard is 3 parts per billion, that's on a rolling average, so it really doesn't take into account the peaks. So during peak season, it could actually be, the water that's going to the consumers could actually be higher than 3 parts per billion. So it depends on what systems they have and really the time of year. And that's one of, at least my personal perspective, is that the MCL does not take into account peaks. Okay, so just go back a little bit in terms of atrazine. As an anti-androgen, prevents androgens from expressing their biological effects on responsive tissues, thus affecting maleness. Sort of went over that. Okay, here it is. So it's estimated that about 5 out of every 1,000 boys in the United States are born with hypospadias. I've seen that, that's a number from the CDC. I've also recently read that it's as much as 10 per 1,000. And so there's been some monitoring studies, and they've seen that it's doubled, and the only cause that they can, or one of the causes certainly, is environmental. Okay, so scientific evidence of causation, of course, they test pesticides, herbicides on animals, and they've tested them in rats and have found that a rat is an acceptable model, and atrazine was seen to cause hypospadias in rats. Another birth defect that's been associated with atrazine is gastroschisis, essentially where the intestines are born outside of the abdominal wall. Or when a baby is born, the intestines are outside the abdominal wall. Oh, and this one, yes, I'm sorry, this is my fault. This slide should have been in the hypospadias section. There was an epidemiology study done in Texas from the Texas Birth Defects Registry, essentially looking at county level estimates of atrazine exposure from USGS data, and they observed consistent associations between medium-low and or medium levels of estimated periconceptual maternal residential atrazine exposure and hypospadias and cryptorchidism. And this study just affirmed some prior animal data and epidemiologies. Sorry about that. Back to gastroschisis. There was also a study done in Washington State that found maternal exposure to surface water atrazine associated with fetal gastroschisis, again, particularly in spring conceptions. As I was saying earlier, since atrazine is used mostly in the spring, there are a lot of peaks, a lot of runoff, and there are much higher concentrations in drinking water in the spring. And this looked at, this study was between, if I recall, this study looked at data from 1987 through 2006 and looked at birth records in a database, comparing it to areas of high atrazine use, and it found that moms who lived less than 16 miles from areas with high concentrations of atrazine in the surface water were more likely to have the disease. And actually, Washington State's average for gastroschisis incidence is 2 times the national average. Some long-term outcomes, chronic short gut syndrome resulting in diarrhea, slow weight gain, vitamin or mineral deficiencies, increased mortality, removal of additional intestines. There was also a gastroschisis cluster found in North Carolina, again, where pesticides in surface waters were extremely high. Small for gestational age and intrauterine growth restriction. I don't know if you can see that. Okay. 2 other birth defects associated with atrazine. There have been a few epidemiology studies done looking at these 2 birth defects. 2 were in Indiana, the Munger study. Intrauterine growth restriction, was in Ohio. Ochoa Kuna was in Indiana. Again, drinking water, herbicide exposure associated with small for gestational age and preterm delivery. And the herbicide was atrazine, of course. The Chevrier study was done in France. Something that's interesting about the Chevrier study, atrazine was banned in France, in the EU, in 2004. But this study was conducted several years later. So even though atrazine was banned, it was still prevalent in the water. And lastly, another epidemiology study, again, low levels of atrazine associated with increased risk of SGA. Some long-term effects: hypertension, cholesterolemia, cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, mental health problems. Any questions?
Okay, first question. Has the EPA completed adequate testing on atrazine?
Well, there has been a lot of testing done on atrazine. We saw in the earlier presentation that there's registrations. I believe it's every 6 years. Atrazine was under re-review as a result of the water pollution case that we brought. I think there could be more done, we'll just say that. And as we were also, someone mentioned independent studies. I think that is an issue as well. A lot of the scientific studies are industry funded. I think that is certainly an issue. And it's having an independent body, I think, would certainly be useful. I think that one of the issues with the way the EPA works is they do get a ton of data, but it's evaluating that data. So if the industry just throws a ton of data at them and they have to evaluate it all, they can be buried in a sea of data that may not actually be very useful.
Second question. What effect does atrazine have on females or the elderly?
Question. So atrazine is an endocrine disruptor. It alters the estrogen-androgen balance. And one thing that they look at in one of the points, they look at luteinizing hormone suppression with atrazine. So basically, it can suppress ovulation in women, obviously. And if you talk to Tyrone Hayes, you can look at his, well, I guess it's really males, but males turning into hermaphrodites.
Okay, last question. In reference to the case, why did it take so long for anyone at the state level to respond to this incident? I'm assuming they're talking about your plaintiffs.
I don't know. That's a very good question. The cases were brought in Illinois, and they started in about 2004. Took a really long time for them to conclude. I came to the firm in 2010, so it was sort of well underway. But I really don't know why the Illinois EPA didn't do anything. Any other questions?
Goals in public health, what's happening legislatively, and who can we contact?
Okay. Anyone on the panel want to handle that?
I can't speak to the specifics on that, but
Excuse me, is there any way you could let him have a microphone?
Oh, yeah.
Just kind of,
I can talk a bit about it if you like. I'm not a legislative expert by any means, but we have some very active legislatures here in Oregon, and we're very well represented. all you need to do is write letters and ask to speak to them, whether it be if you're concerned, and forestry issues that are going on lately, you've heard about landslides, you've heard about chemicals, harvesting levels. I'm just speaking to the forestry side. That's how rules and laws get changed. You know, people come to me a lot of times with the, you need to stop them from doing this, or, you know, and they look at me or they look at the agency in particular. And again, I'm only speaking forestry here, but that's not how, you know, we don't have that authority to do that. Policemen don't have the authority to just go write tickets for anybody. You know, they have to break laws. Those laws are created by the legislature, and those laws are brought into the legislature by people like yourselves. So I would just say become active, write letters, and go speak to your legislatures. You can start with your commissioners. I heard we had a local commissioner here, or representative. Thank you for coming, by the way. But, you know, that's my own personal bias right there, is I do, as a state official, I tire of people telling me I need to do this. That's not how we work in government, and it just takes some involvement from yourselves.
Do you know what the process was in Europe that got it banned?
No, I do not.
They work off the precautionary principle in Europe, so,
What was that?
in Europe, they work on the precautionary principle. So, above a certain level in the water supply, no matter what it is, it's gotta go. So, in the case of atrazine, what they use in Europe now is basically the sister chemical, which has an additional, basically a bigger molecule, and so it binds the soil, so it doesn't run off. So unless you're, at least less children are eating some of the soil or, you know, whatever, they don't have atrazine in their water because they took it off the market.
So the question was asked, how many aerial applications? If you speak of just chemical, there's ground application, there's aerial application, and that's just a subset of the total notifications that we have. We have some that are just for timber harvest, pre-commercial thinning, road building. So that number is lower as far as the number of, I don't know how many aerial applications we have in a year. When I say we go out and monitor 8 to 10 of them, I'd say on average. That's just of those aerial applications of chemicals.
So my question then would be, if you increase that number by some amount that you inspected more, do you think you would see any more cases that you might could cite? That would be something I would think you could do as a state official.
I don't believe so, to be honest with you.
You think you're catching all of them that you get?
I think we're catching we're not catching anything, to be honest with you. We're seeing
So evidence
they're
of
complying with
lack
the
of
law.
evidence means you don't have any.
No, that's not
cases.
entirely true.
Well, I'm just asking the question.
We don't go out and never physically inspect all of our spray units, but in subsequent inspections of that unit, we'll see if that chemical landed off target or not.
And that's our main focus. Again, when I talked about herbicides earlier, they're an easy catch.
So you
When it
go
comes
look
to-
at all the sites afterwards.
When it comes to, we'll go out and see those sites afterwards.
You see all the sites after.
I was just talking about active, the day they're flying the helicopter and me being out on the ground watching
So,
them.
but as long as you inspect them all afterwards, I feel better about that. I didn't understand that you were doing that.
Then one last thing I'll say, then I'll move on, and that's just, speaking of the Department of Forestry, you know, I consider us a pretty lucky agency in that if you know, just Western Lane District, half of Lane County, we've got 4 stewardship foresters. Coosa, how many work? They've got 5 stewardship foresters. If you have an issue today that you believe that logging's going on wrong or bad spray, you make a phone call, I'll just about guarantee the same day you made that phone call, you'll have a guy in your yard. There's not many other agencies, and not to bash on DEQ or anybody else, but they just don't have the personnel that we do for monitoring these forest
I
operations.
appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. I saw a hand over here, and then we'll go here and here.
I was just going to ask the question, we heard that, that the federal government in the 1980s or early 90s stopped aerial spraying on federal forest lands where presumably there still is a lot of harvest of trees going on. So my question is, what's happened on those lands and how come they can do it, but we can't do it on state private lands? Or has there been any study to compare what's happened economically or ecologically on those 2 lands? And is there anything to learn from that comparison?
Federal government manages their timberlands as more of an ecological basis. So they encourage some of the brush to come up, like the alders, which are nitrogen fixing, and some other shrub that might provide some habitat. They go in and manually, well, first of all, too, we don't see the clear cuts that are happening on private land like we see on the federal lands. But certainly, when they started to ban in the 1980s, there was a lot of clear cutting directly after that. And what they would do is go in and manually cut the trees down, the hardwoods that were growing up. But now, on federal lands, we don't really see those kind of clear cuts at all. And so we don't have the competition coming up as you do on the private lands. But there was still that window where the federal agencies did clear cut and didn't spray. So perhaps they don't need to make as much money off of their clear cuts. Anyone else have a comment on that? Or?
No, I have a question here.
You talking to me?
Yes.
All of these pesticides,
I need you to stand up so we can hear you.
from what I read, I think pesticide use, this started after World War II, which is when most pesticides were invented. Simply because they needed to find a market for them after World War II was over. Now, how can this kind of an issue that has such incredibly serious effects on the health of people be managed simply because some companies need to have a market for their products? I mean, what is our government up to?
So we need
That's
to,
my question.
what is our government up to? I don't know
How
that anybody on the
how can
Republican
our
panel.
government have those kinds of priorities for something that is affecting our environment, our health? It just seems just such an aberration to handle it simply as an economic issue.
Yes, I understand that's a heart issue, but I don't think anybody here on the planet wants to handle that. Thank you. Over here.
I guess I was wondering, yes, we can write our congressman, which I've done, and we can try and move our state, especially the tax issues, because we're really facing hard economic times, especially in Curry County. We can try to change that taxing issue in terms of lumber to bring some of that money back to Curry County. But is our best way to contact our government officials who perhaps are very busy doing other things, or are class action suits the way to kind of get people to pay attention to this? I mean, maybe you do both the carrot and the stick at the same time. What is your experience with this?
I mean, I can tell you that right now Atrazine is a very popular. There was a piece done on Canadian 60 Minutes, if you will, because they have issues. It was a piece very well done. I'm sure you can find it online. It was a result of two things. One, the case, and this also the scientist Tyrone Hayes, who studies frogs. But there were documents featured that we got released through the litigation that are highlighted in the piece. So, Google it, check it out. The class action was effective for the water pollution case because they had similar damages, and the issue was the same, the water filtration, and that's essentially the way class actions work. They have the same issue, common facts, numerosity, etc.
Does that move legislators in terms of the economic impact of suits being?
I mean, I think it does. It certainly got a lot of press. Again, the only reason why Atrazine was under re-review was as a result of the case, because it got so much press. So That's certainly positive, but, on the birth defect issue, those are individual cases. And I actually have one on file in southern Illinois. I represent a little boy and his family, a little boy who has hypospadias. So.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I guess my question is going to be going to directly at you, sweetie. Fish. Okay, we've got the. Yeah, you. Sorry, I couldn't remember your
Bigger
name.
pointer.
I'm a pointer. Okay, so fish and runoff that comes from many of these chemicals that, especially if you're spraying over headwaters, and it, of course, then has like a 10 to a 90-day life, even in water or longer, and it goes down into fish-bearing streams. Can you speak about what happens to fish? Is that going to be more him?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. Let me point different directions here then.
Does it bioconcentrate? Should we be eating rogue salmon?
None of these pesticides none of the herbicides that were used recently in Cedar Valley bioconcentrate.
Okay.
So the question is, what about fish? So
So she's talking about how the fish are affected when,
Right.
especially when multiples are used. And multiples were used, so
Yes.
I'm asking about the fish.
And so again, you need to understand how those chemicals might affect fish and whether it's plausible from an understanding of how they're toxic that they might be synergistic. And for the most part, it's my understanding, particularly at low levels. So one of the concerns with synergism is, and mixtures is, let's say EPA sets a safe level for them individually, right? And all of the chemicals are in the water below the level that EPA has a concern about. But they're there, but there's more than one of them there. And so now you're saying, well, maybe they evaluated them individually and said they're okay because they're at a level, they're individually below their level of concern. But maybe as a mixture, that raises them as a group above some level of concern. And so EPA does make a determination, but it's based on the individual way that they're toxic to the fish. And it's based on an understanding of toxicology. Is it plausible that they're additive in some way? It's simple when you look at a class of compounds like the organophosphates, which are neurotoxins. Those are additive. If you have 3 of them in water, they add up. And EPA EPA does risk assessments now for classes of chemicals that they know act by the same mode of action. They do what's called a cumulative risk assessment, and you got to add them up. But if the chemicals are all different, like that list of herbicides that I showed you that were used in Cedar Valley, those don't get added up because they act by a different mechanism.
Yes, however, when you take one compound and you mix it with the second compound,
Yeah.
the compound always changes. Everybody is different, but those toxins don't
Okay,
affect different things differently.
In different people.
Different people, they affect the fish, because you told me that they don't actually test when you mix those chemicals.
No, but they understand how they work individually, and they know from an understanding of toxicology whether there's a potential for them to be either additive or synergistic.
Individually.
Right.
But when you mix them, the compounds of each change.
No, they don't really change.
Every compound changes when you mix it.
No, I would disagree with that.
Okay. Now, respectfully, respect you on that.
Thank you. I think that hand is first. Go ahead.
Yeah, this is a question for Wade. I think I understood that the State Forest Practices Act requires a 60-foot buffer between the target of the spray area and a stream, fish-bearing stream. It's hard to believe that's really enough. What kind of testing was done to determine that that's an adequate amount of buffer to prevent drift from hitting the stream itself?
Well, the agency itself we do monitoring, and we've done some specific ones, and I don't have those, I don't know if you guys know those dates of a couple of our specific chemical monitoring processes, but we do monitor the rules that we have, whether it be for chemical use, even for harvesting and shade and landslides, you name it. That is for that 60 feet was determined specifically to address a small amount of drift, meaning that we're accepting that there is going to be potentially some side-to-side movement based upon a little bit of wind or whatever the measure may be. 60 feet and the droplet size, all things considered, has shown that that won't impact that stream, but that's enough. And sometimes, oftentimes actually, if you look at a large fish-bearing stream, we have a 100-foot buffer, and a lot of times you'll see 100-foot buffers along that stream of no trees cut for 100 feet. So a lot of the applications are actually further away or greater than 100 feet. Another thing that you'll see chemical applicators do, again, they have the rule, they can't directly apply, but to minimize that drift, they'll do what they call split booming. So you saw the pictures, all the helicopters you saw today had 2 booms out. Well, they'll only activate 1 boom, and based on the rotor width, the rotor rotation, the way those are flying, that'll control their drift a lot better. Mr. Odenthal could probably speak even more, but there's practices like that to ensure that that drift does not impact or reach the water, because it is illegal. If they directly apply that chemical into water, they've violated it.
Are there actual studies of this, or is this just your kind of anecdotal experience monitoring what happens?
There are studies of that, yes.
It was in the 90s was when it was last submitted for the larger buffers.
Was it in the
Early
90s?
94.
If you give me your information after we're done here, I can send you a link to some information there on that.
Thank you. First, this gentleman right here, right there. No.
Chemical mixtures.
Could you stand up so we can hear you?
Chemical mixtures, are those addressed on labels? What can be mixed, what chemicals can be mixed? Are the chemicals, are the sprayers doing it on their own, mixing chemicals?
Generally, no, it's not on the list. One of the concerns with mixing chemicals, the actual product, the formulated product, is some products are incompatible.
Right.
And so you mix 2 products together that have different active ingredients in them, but they're 2 different products. The other components of the product, the formulation, isn't compatible. And so you don't want to mix them. If you mix them in your tank and then you don't get a homogeneous solution, or you get something settling out. There's those concerns about mixing products. But if a product is labeled to be used in forestry, the label doesn't say that you, and you've got 4 products that are labeled for use in forestry. The label doesn't generally say that you can't apply them all at the same time. And I don't know if you want to comment on that at all.
There are sometimes you'll find mixes recommended on the label,
right.
But most of the time you're right, they don't.
No. And in theory, there has been some thought put into that by EPA, knowing that they've registered these products on for the same site of the same crop, that they could be used simultaneously. And the outcome has been evaluated, but that's not something that's readily available.
Thank you. Okay. This gentleman here, and then the 2 in the back, and then we'll get to you. Okay?
I had a follow-up question for Link, and I guess my question is, so just to follow up on that buffer question, EPA, I think, is proposed to disapprove Oregon's non-point source control program, which is in part the Oregon Forest Practices rules that we've been talking about, the buffer widths, and has proposed to finding that they're inadequate on this pesticide issue and also on some other issues. So I wonder if you could provide the department's perspective on EPA's findings with respect to those buffer issues.
I'm going to respectfully say no, I can't answer that. I'm just being honest. I can't answer that question for you. I apologize.
I don't have the mic, but that sounds like a Clean Water Act question rather than a label, a fifth or label question.
It goes with the Clean Water Act. What EPA has said is that the buffer widths that are being used by the department are inadequate to protect water quality standards and beneficial uses.
Okay, yeah, there is some.
We were talking about
Correct. There is some work on that right now, and whether or not our rules, and and our rules do have to meet Clean Water Act. So we're working closely actually with DEQ right now, because DEQ gets their funding at the national level, and we have to basically ensure that our rules meet that, or they're going to discontinue funding, to make a long story short. And so I know that is something, I'm not on that committee by any means, but that's being worked on a study right now. I don't know if there's anybody else in here that knows more about that than myself, but long story short is our rules do have to meet the Clean Water Act.
Thank you.
We have
The
like
gentleman
5
in the back.
minutes, I'm sorry, before we wanted to close the workshop. I know the janitor's here till 10. And I'm willing to hang out, but out of respect for everybody else that's here and our panelists, I just wanted to give it a few minutes. Can we talk about what do you guys feel as a community members? What's your feeling? What do we want to do with all this information and education that we just received as a community? And if we're not prepared to voice that right now, if we could please at least capture contact information for everyone at the table back here so that we can keep this dialogue moving forward and maybe come to some kind of consensus as a community as to what we'd like to do with what we've learned tonight. And if anything, you know, do we want, again, as Lisa mentioned at the top of the workshop, do we want to have another workshop where we narrow our focus, maybe to a more of a water quality specific, or so I'd like to hear from some folks if you're prepared to give us some suggestions right now before we hit that 9 o'clock witching hour.
Can I make a suggestion?
Sure.
Being grilled by questions, I get a chance to suggest. I just want to, I've been a component of the Highway 36 spray investigation for several years now, and have been invited to several of their community meetings. And I just want to commend you all, quite honestly, at how this has been run tonight, and genuinely thank you, because I've been grilled and yelled at and mistreated a few times in my honest opinion, and Mike has been right there beside me, and I really appreciate what you guys are doing as a community here, and the respect that you've shown us. So personally, for myself, I'd like to thank you for that this evening.
And myself as well.
Yes, indeed, give yourselves a hand, because you have indeed been very respectful and kind, and I thank you for really taking those basic precepts to heart, and you have. And so we will, do we want to, okay, let's have your question, dear.
My husband and I went to a park meeting in January. And it was a general consensus by everybody there that the park people need to come up with a simple way that doctors can make one phone call to get an answer. We did not have that here. Has that been set up? That was in January, this is April. Has that been set up yet?
So speaking from the point of the park coordinator's desk is about 50 feet away from mine, and we talk on a daily basis. They are indeed in the process of working that through so that there is a specific protocol on how do we handle that question when it comes into any park agency, as well as getting that information out into the medical community so they know who to call and what to ask, so that we don't have a series of questions that would come up otherwise.
I just don't want that to get dropped.
And we don't either.
And Mike, if I'm, Oregon Health Authority and the state of Oregon has a wonderful health alert network.
Yes,
It could be utilized if it's not already being considered. I'd like if you could take that back to Park and say that hand would be an awesome way to push that information out to the medical community.
Yeah.
I'm the administrator for Curry County, and if I get a hand notification about any kind of outbreak, exposure and push it out to every medical provider in the county. And
Yep.
that's my job. So that would be a really great way for you to share information or PARC to share information.
You bet. And OHA is a critical part of PARC and in that whole process.
So can I have a quick follow-up on that? I was at that meeting that you were at, and I think I commented on your concern and why there wasn't a better way of getting information to doctors. And I am a consultant to PARC, and I truly believe that your presence there had an impact on the PARC board, and I think the chances are good.
We don't like to drop because it was like, what's the left hand doing and what's the right hand doing? And from what I got of it, all they needed was make one phone call. One phone call.
Thank you. I'll take this last one.
It's for Mike Odenthal. So Mike, through this entire thing that has been happening, I wasn't trying to, bring up the Cedar Valley incident, but it does have a kind of an impact on the question I'm going to ask you. So I specifically asked you how come there wasn't a faster response? And if there had been a faster response, I mean, you didn't know how big of a spill or spray or whatever we had down here. Has the Department of Agriculture set up a different type of system, or are they looking at a different type of system to investigate these incidences that happen in a more timely manner as a faster response?
So the timely response will generally be within the first couple of days after an incident.
Yes.
In this particular case, it took us about 5 days, but most of the questions came in as the weekend came, and so we were here within a couple days after we really got the complaints. That's not bad. I saw, is the objective to get here within 24 hours? Yeah, that's the objective. Is it always going to happen? No. I don't know how much difference it would have made, and we're not here to talk about the case. I don't want to go into specifics about the case.
Right.
But it is our objective to get here as quickly as we can, and 24 hours is really the ultimate objective. But we are looking at investigating an incident that happened, so it's really we're looking at post-mortem, if you will, not something that's actively happening.
Okay, that answered my question. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to need to bring this to a close. We have a quick question that can be answered.
EPA is now doing new models for the drift. Do you have an idea when that may come out? Because it's so far different than what our existing regulations and laws show.
This will be our last question. Thank you.
Yes, EPA is moving forward on drift, but there's still a long ways to go. Most labels right now say something like, don't allow drift.
Yeah, that's true.
And there should be, and so it's really, it really comes down to the training of the applicators, which I'm involved in. And I train aerial applicators, and I've worked with the National Aerial Applicators Association in the past. It really comes down to the training they get as a part of their recertification, and not something that's on the label. And maybe that should be different. More work needs to be done on it, a lot more work. The irony is that forestry has the luxury of using very large droplets compared to other ways that pesticides are used in agriculture. But then they've got terrain issues. So they've got large droplets that really help them control drift, but they've got terrain issues and weather conditions sometimes that are challenging, that make it more difficult to control drift. So there still needs to be a lot of work done.
Okay, I want to thank the panel. You've been terrific. I want to thank the audience. It's been incredible.